All right, you guys, today we're going to talk about decolonization in Africa and Asia. Now, this is a topic that you have some background knowledge in already, so my goal today is to reinforce that knowledge. Notice we're talking about decolonization in the period from 1945 to about 1970. Now, there were some nations in Africa and Asia that gained independence prior to the end of World War II, and there are some nations that actually did not gain independence until after 1970, but the bulk of nations in both Asia and Africa, so somewhere around 70 odd nations, all gained independence in nearly a 2-decade period. That's kind of crazy. Let's talk about it. In order to understand decolonization, we need to go back a little bit and remember what these nations are trying to gain independence from. So we want to do a little bit of a review from colonialism and imperialism. Hopefully this is something that you remember from Modern World History 1. If not, I'm going to tell Mr. Keller. All right, so colonialism. 19th century, we know European countries, they are attempting to colonize Asia and Africa pretty successfully. Why are they doing this? What is their goal? Their goal is to gain raw materials and also create new markets to sell their produced goods to. So they're trying to gain new raw materials such as wood, it's going to say lumber, rubber, metals, etc., and then build these raw materials in factories, and now they have new markets to sell these manufactured goods back to at a much higher price. What does this mean for the colonies? There is no industrialization. All factories and production are occurring in Europe. There is no modernization. So when we think about Europe and how much it has grown and all the technological advancements in the 19th century, that's not happening in Africa or Asia. So no industrialization, no modernization, and there's very little education for the colonized peoples. Most people exist to work in the fields, work on plantations. A lot of times, especially in Africa, we see a lot of still examples of slave labor. So it's not to the Europeans' benefit to provide an education, because as we know, one of the best ways to control a group of people is to take away their access to education. So there's little to no education for the colonized peoples. You don't need to write this down, but in the grand scheme of things, this is connected to the Industrial Revolution, because as Europe is producing excuse me, more goods, and they therefore are needing the raw materials, which is one of the reasons why they start colonizing. All right, so what does colonialism look like in the colonies? There are two forms of rule that the Europeans practice: direct rule and indirect rule. You might remember this, hopefully you remember this. But direct rule, that's when Europeans themselves are in charge of the governments in the colonies. So the Europeans, they are there physically in the colonies. They are overseeing the extraction of raw materials, etc., and they have a very large role. So direct rule is when Europeans are in charge of the governments physically in the colonies. Indirect rule, as you might imagine, is when Europeans rule colonies through colonial indigenous governors. So the Europeans still own the colonies, they're still in control, but they are not playing such a large role in the colonies. Instead, they appoint Africans and Asians to rule over other Africans and Asians. So indirect rule is when Europeans ruled the colonies through colonial indigenous governors. We'll see this in countries like Rwanda, in which the Germans and then the Belgians appointed the Tutsis as governors and overseers over the Hutus. This is going to lead to a lot of tension and strife after these colonies gained independence. Spoiler alert. In all of the colonies, regardless direct or indirect rule, in all of the colonies, you have an upper class of colonized people created. So there's an upper class of indigenous. When I say indigenous, these are people who are native to the land. So Africans themselves living in Africa are indigenous. Native Americans here in America, they are the indigenous peoples. It's a good word to know. So we have this upper colonialized indigenous class. These indigenous people, they had greater access to education. This is going to be a European education, however, so they're learning European history, European languages, etc. So the indigenous peoples had access to a European education, as well as they held more power in the colonies because they were at times governors, plantation managers, overseers. So they held more powers in the colonies. All right, so that's colonialism in the colonies. Specifically, colonialism in Asia begins around 1600 until the mid-1960s. This is after the Dutch first and the Spanish first establish a presence, and then other countries follow suit. So Great Britain, the Dutch, the Netherlands, France, Spain, and the United States have the greatest control in the region. The purpose is to control trade routes and to extract profitable raw materials. So the purpose, they want to control trade routes. Think about Christopher Columbus, Marco Polo, everyone that's trying to get from Asia back to Africa, as well as extract raw materials. They're similar to Africa. In the 20th century, we remember that Japan is going to annex and control Korea, and followed by Indochina, Indonesia, and the rest of Africa as well. So Japan in the 20th century is annexing and controlling the region all the way, starting in 1910, and then definitely all the way up and through World War II. Colonialism, oh, there's a map of Asia for you, how nice. All right, colonialism in Africa, starting really the mid-19th century, but 1885 is a seminal year. Does anyone remember why? 1885? Berlin Conference, good times, when the Europeans got together and carved up Africa, with the exception of two areas, and that's going to be Ethiopia and Liberia. But everyone else gets carved up and becomes a colony of a European power. And this lasts until 1945-ish, following the end of World War II. Notice we see World War II coming up again and again and again. So as I just said, nearly the entire continent is colonized as a colony. So nearly the entire continent is a colony of a European power. That's with the exception of Ethiopia, which manages to maintain its independence until good old Mussolini comes along, and Liberia, which was founded in the early 19th century as a free state for former slaves to return to from the Americans. So despite the fact that we were still having a lot of slavery in our country, we thought that we'd make ourselves feel good by creating a colony for freed slaves to go to, the few. The colonial boundaries are going to be created by the Europeans. And that's something important to note, that these boundaries are created by Europeans. They completely ignore traditional borders. They completely ignore tribal alliances and tribal conflicts. So they're going to ignore the traditional borders and where tribes are. And there's thousands of tribes in Africa at this time. But the Europeans are going to ignore that, and they're going to create their borders wherever they want, completely ignoring the alliances, so who are friends with whom, and who is in conflict with whom. What is the result of this? You see conflicting tribes in the same colony, so tribes that have animosity and tension, now they are forced to live in the same area, under the same rule. And then you even see other tribes are going to be split into separate colonies. So you might have tribes, you might have clans that one is part of a colony of the French, and then the other part is going to be part of the colonies of the English, having very different lives. So completely ignoring the traditional areas of the Africans. All right, so that actually leads us to independence, because as you can imagine, this is not an ideal situation for neither the Asians nor the Africans. So let's talk about what leads to their independence. So there are several factors, internal and external. We're going to talk about the internal first. The first internal factor is a factor that we've been talking about since September, and that is self-determination. Of course, it's an ability of a people to choose for themselves what type of government they're going to have. Now remember, I talked about those educated upper-class Africans who are receiving a European education. So they're educated and they're learning from Europeans about self-determination after World War I. And they're starting to say, hey, we're learning about self-determination, but we are not practicing self-determination. We want to do that. So these educated Africans learn about it, and this is going to be one of the things that inspires them to start clamoring for independence. We also have another oldie but a goodie, and that is nationalism. Nationalism, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, is going to encourage Africans to celebrate their own culture, their own history, their own languages, their own customs, in opposition to the colonial histories, etc. So nationalism is encouraging Africans to celebrate their own culture and have pride in their own culture. And something we'll see again when we learn in South Africa and learn about one of my favorite people, Steve Biko. He speaks about this a lot. Finally, the third factor that's going to lead to independence for Africa, it's going to be the Pan-African movement and the Negritude movements. And these are two political movements that are founded in the early 20th century. This is definitely going to be from the upper class, the educated, the more wealthy Africans. They are going to found this. It's actually inspired by similar movements in the United States and the Caribbean. So the Pan-African, you see Pan-African movements in the Caribbean. There's a lot of Afro-Caribbean groups. You also see Pan-African and Negritude movements in the United States from freed African Americans. So they're inspired by movements in the US and the Caribbean. They're going to celebrate African cultures. So they're similar to nationalism, celebrating African cultures. And they're going to unite the African people, Pan-Africanism. This means that this is not just one movement for one group of people, but really this is a movement to unite all the peoples in the continent. So uniting all of the peoples of Africa. Externally, we see a lot of factors as well, and some of this we're hopefully familiar with from our reading earlier this week. But the first factor is, of course, going to be World War II. World War II is going to weaken the European powers because they are spending so much time fighting and destroying each other. They no longer have the resources, they don't have the wealth, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the energy to continue colonialism. So World War II is going to weaken European powers. The United Nations, newly formed, is going to oppose colonialism. As we've learned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, colonialism flies in the face of a lot of what the UDHR stands for. So the UN is going to oppose colonialism. The United States and the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, they want more allies. So they are going to support independence, because if that's a new independent nation, that could be a new ally for either America or the Soviet Union. So they want new countries for their allies. And then Asia. In Asia, we see newly independent nations who are going to throw their support for the Africans. Gandhi actually works in South Africa for a while. He's very familiar with a lot of Southern African politics. He is going to be very vocal in supporting African independence, as are many other Asian leaders. So we have the World War II, we have UN, we have the America and the Soviet Union, and we have many nations in Asia who are all supporting independence. Combined with the internal factors, it's going to help lead to independence for Africa. Before we talk about that, however, let's talk about what's happening in Asia. Asia, we see a lot of independence movements. Similar to Africa, we see independence movements begun after World War I. Why? Because they're also hearing about self-determination. In Asia, especially India, Indonesia, etc., you see a lot of Asian peoples that actually fight for the colonial powers in World War I, sometimes promised independence. So there's a movement that starts after World War I to really start gaining independence that we see in Asia. Specifically, we see this in India. India, we have two groups that fight for independence in the early 20th century. One is the Congress Party, and the other is the Muslim League. The Congress Party is the party that is led by Gandhi at a time. It's largely made up of Hindu Indians. They have their other group, and that's known as the Muslim League. And the Muslim League is led by a man named Muhammad Ali Jinnah. I'll spell that out. Muhammad, various spellings. Ali, A-L-I, and then Jinnah, J-I-N-N-A-H. And these two groups, the Congress Party, the Hindu, led by Gandhi, and the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they are going to push for Indian self-rule. And in 1935, they are granted self-rule due to the 1935 India Act, in which Great Britain says, you're still our colony, but we will let you have more autonomy, we'll let you have more self-rule. So this is the first movement towards independence, but England is not willing to give up India just quite yet. India is the jewel in their crown, but they'll give them some more autonomy. Same thing happens actually with Ireland a couple decades prior. In addition, we see that there's pre-World War II nationalist movements in Indochina, as well as in Indonesia. So we start to see more groups of people fighting, supporting nationalism. So we see greater amounts of nationalist movements in pre-World War II Asia. So internally, we see a lot of colonized people starting to clamor and demand independence. Externally, we're going to see that following the end of World War II, lands taken over by the Japanese are freed. And remember, Asia has a little bit of a different history in that you have a lot of these colonies, and then starting in the early 20th century, Japan is going to come along and start annexing and taking over many of these colonies and controlling them up through World War II. So once World War II is over, once Japan surrenders, there's a question of what to do with these countries. Are they given independence, or do they go back to their former colonial powers? And we'll see kind of both of these things occurring. So these former colonial as well as Japanese subjects are peacefully and forcefully demanding their continued independence because they're basically, following that World War II, they're given a little bit of independence before these powers are able to decide what to do with them, because the nations that win World War II are trying to figure out what to do with Japan and Germany and various other countries. So basically, the former colonies, they kind of get forgotten about for a little bit. So they basically demand, we want to continue that. And then we know also that World War II is going to weaken the European powers again, so it's going to be difficult for them to actually come back and recolonize, as they have few resources to continue or to attempt to recolonize these Asian colonies. All right, so that leads us to actual independence. What actually happens? So we're going to talk about two areas in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and then we'll look at North Africa, which is a little bit unique unto itself. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we have Ghana is going to be our first sub-Saharan independent country. And they gain independence very quickly. They're going to be the first country to gain independence in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's basically Africa below the Saharan Desert. Saharan Desert obviously covers the northern good chunk of Africa, and this is everything below, all the way down to South Africa. So they're the first sub-Saharan independent country, and they're going to inspire the rest of the continent. The individuals that clamor for independence in Ghana definitely go around and inspire other nations as well. We see other countries peacefully acquiring independence. So other countries follow Ghana's lead and peacefully acquire independence. Nigeria is a good example of that. These countries, they use boycotts. A boycott is a refusal to buy goods. They use protests, they use strikes, they use largely peaceful means. However, many more countries are going to fight for their independence and fight wars for independence. So many other countries fight wars for independence. Countries such as Angola, Congo, Kenya, Mozambique, Cameroon, and Rhodesia, which actually is now the nation of Zimbabwe. So Angola, Congo, Kenya, Mozambique, Cameroon, and Rhodesia, which becomes Zimbabwe, all fight at times very brutal wars for their independence. Now, North Africa is a little bit different because North Africa is primarily controlled by two countries. England in the east, England's going to control Egypt and Sudan, etc., and then France in the northwest. And pretty much all the countries in northwestern Africa were French colonies. And the French, they do not want these colonies to be freed. They want to continue colonization. But by 1960, they've granted independence to 15 of their colonies. So Morocco, Mali, Chad, Tunisia, Libya, etc. They've granted independence. So they at first resist decolonization, but by 1960, they're going to grant independence to 15 of their colonies. Why is this happening? Because they suffered massive losses in Indochina. You remember when we talked about the Vietnam War? The French suffer the loss at Dien Bien Phu. They get kicked out of Vietnam, and then America steps in. And they don't have the resources to maintain them, with the exception of one, and that's Algeria. France is going to be willing to give up all those other colonies because they're desperate to keep Algeria. It's the one colony they won't give up. Partly because you have 2 million French people that are living in Algeria at this time. So they see it as an extension of France, and they don't want to let it go. This is going to lead to a civil war that lasts from 1954 to 1962. So Algeria is the one colony that France won't give up because you have 2 million French people living in the colony, and that's going to lead to a civil war that lasts from 1954 to 1962. It's a very brutal civil war. It's fought between the French and the FLN, which is French for National Liberation Front, which I could say it in French, but I won't torture you. So the National Liberation Front, they're going to fight the French, and they use guerrilla tactics. It's very similar to the Vietnamese. They got a lot of information from the Vietnamese as well as other countries that are fighting for independence, and they used a lot of guerrilla tactics. When I say guerrilla, I don't mean guerrilla like cousins of the apes that we see in the zoos, which is so sad. I mean guerrilla as a war tactic. So that's G-U-E-R-I-L-L-A. So guerrilla war tactics. It's a very bloody war. Hundreds of thousands of Algerians die, many of which are civilians, and there's many war crimes committed. Hundreds of thousands of Algerians die, many are civilians, and there are many war crimes committed. It's incredibly brutal. And for the people who lived during this war, and there are still many people who are alive, you don't need to write this down, but it's a cause of tension between North Africa and France to the present day. It's one of the things that was brought up when we learned about the Paris bombings back in December and then the Mali bombings that occurred a few days later. Part of the belief behind France being targeted is due to their role in North Africa and partly due to this brutal, bloody war between France and Algeria. All right, so that's independence in Africa. Let's talk about independence in Asia. And I'm going to go through a couple different countries and their experiences so we get a sense of what's happening in that region. So we're going to start with India because all roads start from India. India is going to gain independence in 1947. India is building on the self-rule that had been previously granted and Britain's weakened state from World War II. So this independence is built on the self-rule, previous self-rule, and Britain's weakened state. Remember, Britain's bombed horribly during World War II. They expend so much to fight Germany and the Nazis, and they have very little to maintain India, despite the fact that Winston Churchill says that he will never live in a world in which India is free. Maybe that's why he drank so much, I don't know. All right, so India is going to gain independence and almost immediately be partitioned. And partitioned is a fancy word for split. It's going to be split into Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. As we remember from our map quizzes, Pakistan shares the northwestern border of India. India has a large population of Hindus, as well as a large but still minority population of Muslims, and there's a lot of tension between them. If you remember, I talked about the Congress Party for the Hindu Indians and the Muslim League for the Muslim Indians. This is because they had a lot of tension and could not get along. And out of this tension, it was decided to partition the country. This is something that Gandhi was very vocal against and very heartbreaking for him. But why do they partition? Because these two groups have so much violence and they cannot get along. So what happens is you create India, you create Pakistan, but you have a bunch of Muslims in what's now India, and you have a bunch of Hindus in what's now Pakistan. So in the years following, 10 million refugees flee from one state to the other. So several million Hindus flee what's now Pakistan, and several million Muslims flee what's now India. And they cross the border. It's incredibly brutal and bloody. Nearly 1 million die from violence at this time, in which Hindus are fleeing violence from Muslims and Muslims are fleeing violence from Hindus. It's still incredibly tense. India and Pakistan continue to have a very tense relationship, partly due to remembered bad blood from this time, because it's not that long ago. It's only, what, nearly 70 years? That's a couple generations. There are people that are still alive that remember experiencing this. And then they also have land disputes over areas like Kashmir, etc. I think the week after next, we're going to be watching Extra Credit Gandhi, the seminal 1982 film all about Gandhi, and we'll see actually a lot of this crossing and see the role that it played in newly independent India. So India, as we know, is the jewel in the British crown. And once India gains independence, many of the other colonies are going to follow suit, because once the jewel in the crown is lost, it's pretty much over, and England has to realize that colonialism, despite the fact that the sun shall never set on the British Empire, it finally does in 1947, thanks to Gandhi, thanks to India's independence. So those other colonies, we have Burma, which is also known as Myanmar, which I'll explain, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. So Burma, they're going to experience several political upheavals after independence, which is going to lead to instability. So we first have a leader, but he gets assassinated, and then you see a lot of instability. So Burma has many political upheavals. One leader is in power, and then others are taken after independence, and we see this leading to instability. In 1962, a military state is created, and this is led by an army general known as by the name Ne Win. So in 1962, the military state is created, led by Army General Ne Win, and his spelling of his name is N-E, and then capital W-I-N. So capital N-E, capital W-I-N. He's in power, and he's going to be in power for decades. He's going to suspend the Constitution, and he's going to consolidate his power. He's basically going to put all of his army buddies in large positions of power. And the democratic tradition that Burma has, the brief moments of democracy, is going to be quickly dismantled. So he's going to suspend the Constitution and consolidate his power. In 1988, we have a woman, which you see there in that picture, by the name of Aung San Suu Kyi, who we're going to hear about again because she is so important. Aung San Suu Kyi, you spell her name, capital A-U-N-G, capital S-A-N, capital S-U-U, capital K-Y-I. So Aung San Suu Kyi. She's the leader of the opposition group known as the National Democratic League, the NDL, the National Democratic League. And she is placed under house arrest in 1988. She runs for election, she wins, but Ne Win does not want to have that, so instead he arrests her and places her under house arrest. She's under house arrest until 2010. This woman was under house arrest in your lifetime. Super intense. She's basically a figure of political oppression. She's a figure of democracy. She's so important to the Burmese people. She's so important to the world, frankly. She's placed under house arrest merely for wanting democracy, that she can't have it. Super intense. She's married. She actually she goes to college at Oxford and marries an Englishman, and they have children. And when this happens, she had actually been out of the country. She came back to care for her ailing mother in the mid-1980s, and then gets caught up in politics. Her father had been a political figure, as one that had been assassinated decades prior. So she comes back, she gets caught up, and she starts speaking out for democracy, speaking out against the army general. She's placed under house arrest. Her husband and her children flee back to England because they're English citizens, and they're there. And then she's under house arrest for years and years. And her husband, Michael, actually develops cancer, and he's dying. And at one point, she's given some limited freedoms, and basically Nguyen says, you can go to England, you can see your dying husband, but you can never return to Burma. And she decides to stay in Burma because she has become this figure of democracy, and because she is so committed to democracy that she stays, and her husband actually dies in England and they never see each other. And I think that's so sad, but that's just how impassioned she was for democracy. Finally, in 2010, she is finally freed, and she's now leading Burma into a more democratic state. Burma is still considered under the name Myanmar. When Nguyen takes over in 1962, he changes the name to Myanmar, so that's why you'll see it politically known as Myanmar, but a lot of people still consider it to be Burma, myself included. All right, that was a nice little sidetrack there about Aung San Suu Kyi. Malaysia. Malaysia is going to be recreated as the Malay Federation after World War II. So basically, Malaysia says, we want independence, and England says, meh, let's just call you the Malay Federation, M-A-L-A-Y Federation, and you'll kind of control yourself, but you'll be under British rule, which the Malaysians are okay with until 1957, when they gain full independence. So Malaysia, they're recreated as the Malay Federation, along with Borneo and a couple other areas, under British rule until gaining independence in 1957. Singapore, tiny little, essentially nation, city-state, they gain independence in 1963. So those are the British colonies. Moving on to Indochina, which we've heard a bit about due to our study of the Cold War. So Indochina, as we know, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and these are going to be major Cold War hotspots, primarily due to Vietnam. We know that the French kind of tried to recolonize following World War II, but then in 1954, they suffer a loss at Dien Bien Phu, they get booted out, and the United States gets involved, and thus begins the Vietnam conflict, or the War of Northern Aggression. I'm sorry, that's the Cold War, Civil War. Just the War of American Aggression, but not ever the Vietnam War, because we've never lost a war. So Vietnam, basically, the French try to recolonize, and then the Americans get involved, which turns into the Vietnam conflict, which we know from the Cold War. Cambodia, their neighbor, they're going to be affected by the Vietnam War, although they still have a couple other things happening. So in 1945, the French reoccupy, so just like they go back into Vietnam, they also go into Cambodia, and the French reoccupy until 1953, at which point they're granted independence under a man named Prince Sihanouk. So they're granted independence under Prince Sihanouk, and that's capital S-I-H-A-N-O-U-K, Prince Sihanouk. He's going to rule for 2 years and then abdicate in 1955. So he's going to abdicate, he's going to step down in 1955, and a parliamentary democracy is created. So in 1955, he abdicates, and a parliamentary democracy is created. In the 1960s, we see the government start to come into conflict with a group known as the Khmer Rouge, which unfortunately we will have to hear about because they're terrible. But in the 1960s, we see conflict between the government and the Khmer Rouge. Khmer Rouge is capital K-H-M-E-R, capital R-O-U-G-E, the Khmer Rouge. The Cambodians are known as they're the Khmer people, and Rouge is red in French. So these are the red Khmers, they're the communists. They're led by a man named Pol Pot, who's basically a brutal dictator, who in the 1970s controls Cambodia, and during that time he is going to be responsible for a genocide of 2 million Cambodians. So in the 1970s, Pol Pot is capital P-O-L, capital P-O-T. He is going to be responsible with the Khmer Rouge for a genocide of 2 million Cambodians. And then finally we have Laos, which are the neighbors of Vietnam and Cambodia. They gain independence in 1953. They have a constitutional monarchy that lasts until the communists take over in Laos in 1975. So they gain independence in 1953. They have a constitutional monarchy that lasts until the communist takeover in 1975, following a brutal civil war. And Laos and Cambodia both are very much affected by the Vietnam War. You see the Viet Cong, the communist Vietnamese, they hide out in Cambodia, they hide out in Laos. So when the Americans and South Vietnamese are fighting them, we're also bombing Cambodia, we're also bombing Laos. So they're very much still affected by all that as well. It's important to remember. All right, we also have Indonesia, which is not a country that I think gets talked about. I don't think I ever learned anything about Indonesia, but you guys will. So Indonesia, after World War II, the Dutch, who had been controlling the Indonesians for centuries, they attempt to recreate their colony. So the Japanese had controlled Indonesia, but then following World War II, the Dutch basically say, all right, the Japanese are gone, we're going to reestablish our colony. So the Dutch try to recolonize the area. The Indonesian nationalists, they do not want that, so they're going to wage war against the Dutch until 1949. So the Indonesian nationalists waged war until 1949, at which point the United Nations, the UN is here, they're going to broker the transfer of power from the Dutch to the Indonesian president named Sukarno. So the UN is going to step in and they're basically going to say, Indonesia, you're independent. President Sukarno, you get to control. And Sukarno, he's spelled Sukarno. So Sukarno. Under President Sukarno, the economy is going to struggle. We're going to see instability, which is going to ultimately result in a coup. So the economy is going to struggle, and we're going to see instability, which is going to lead to a coup by a man named Suharto. And Suharto is capital Suharto. So the economy is struggling, coup led by Suharto. Suharto is going to rule the country as a brutal dictator. He's going to rule the country as a police state, lots of corruption, lots of major human rights violations. So he's going to rule the country as a police state, brutal dictator, lots of corruption, lots of human rights violations. One example of the human rights violations is the 1965-1966 genocide, in which 500,000 to a million Indonesians, 500,000 to a million Indonesians are murdered in an anti-communist purge of the country. So basically, Suharto, people are saying you're murdering people, and Suharto's like, no, we're just getting rid of the communists, it's totally fine. But most historians agree now that this was a genocide, that you had Indonesians, people who opposed the government, were specifically targeted and eradicated incredibly brutally. So 500,000 to a million Indonesians are murdered in an anti-communist purge of the country. This brutality continues, the instability continues, until finally in 2001 we see Indonesia moving towards democracy, although something they are still struggling with to this day because Suharto and his rule is not that long ago. Finally, we have other countries that are gaining independence, the Philippines and the Koreas. We're pretty familiar with the Koreas at this point, but for the Philippines, they have kind of an interesting and unique story. The Philippines are actually promised independence in 1898 in exchange for the United States, in exchange for support against the Spanish. So America and Spain, we get into a war. We think that they destroyed our battleship, the Maine, off the coast of Cuba, and really we just want their Spanish colonies. So we go to the Filipinos and we say, hey, if you help us against the Spanish, we'll totally give you your independence. How awesome would that be? Because the Philippines have been controlled by Spain since the 16th century. And the Filipinos are like, cool, we'll totally support you. So the Philippines are promised independence in exchange for support with the Americans against the Spanish. Instead, however, following the war, we beat the Spanish, we get control of the Philippines. It's also how we get control of Cuba and Puerto Rico and Guam and Hawaii. But instead of giving them independence, we say, meh, we're just gonna tell you what to do, and we control the country until the Japanese come and occupy the Philippines. So instead of granting independence, the US controls until the Japanese come along. And the Japanese occupied during World War II. After World War II, Finally, the Philippines are going to actually achieve that independence. So after World War II, they gain independence, but the Philippines struggle with political and democratic stability. So after World War II, they gain independence, but struggle with political and democratic stability. At times we see dictators like Ferdinand Marcos, who's an incredibly terrible dictator, president, who rules the country and basically destroys its economy. His wife, Imelda Marcos, was famous in the 1980s for having 5,000 pairs of shoes, despite the fact that majority of Filipinos were totally suffering, totally poor, and super struggling, but this woman had 5,000 pairs of shoes, so it's super messed up. So that's the Philippines. Korea, real quick, we know that they get divided. The peninsula gets divided after World War II, and we know that after the Korean War, the DMZ zone continues to split North and South Korea. So Korea is still divided. All right, you guys, we're in the home stretch. We just need to talk about the legacy of colonialism. What does it mean for these countries who were so recently colonial states? We see a lot of political instability. So what does this mean? It means that colonial powers leave no political infrastructure when they leave. So when these nations leave, when France leaves, when England leaves, when the Dutch leave, they're like, all right, bye, we're done here. Have fun being independent. But they leave no political infrastructure. So they leave no government support, no government structures. We have few traditional leaders in power because the majority of the indigenous people had been used as workers, as slaves, as supports during World War II. So people who had been traditionally in power have been removed from that power. So you don't have a history of people in power to rely upon. So this power vacuum leads to dictators taking power. So dictators take power in this vacuum, and they're going to oppress their people left and right. What are the results of this? It leads to instability, it leads to conflict, it leads to coups, and it leads to civil wars. So it's going to lead to instability, conflict, coups, and civil wars. Basically everything terrible. If you are dealing with instability and conflict and coups and civil wars, your government obviously is not going to be very effective. So government's ineffective. They cannot provide services and safety and supports for their civilians. So the governments are ineffective and they're not providing supports for their civilians. And also, additionally, countries are not only having internal issues, but they're also fighting with each other politically. So we have them fighting over borders, fighting over resources. So conflict internally and conflict externally. And speaking of that, let's talk about it a little bit more. So internal and external conflict. So as you might recall so long ago, colonies are created arbitrarily. The borders are created arbitrarily, meaning that there's no concern for the traditional borders of the tribes. Arbitrary is a fancy word for without reason. So the next time your parents ask you to go do the dishes, say, is that an arbitrary request? Because I don't want to do the dishes. Conflicting tribes are placed within the same colony. It's going to lead to conflict. Other tribes are split into different colonies. So these colonies are created arbitrarily, without reason, no concern for traditional borders. Conflicting tribes placed within the same colony, which leads to conflict. Other tribes are split into different colonies. New independent countries are going to follow these same borders. Newly independent countries follow the same colonial borders. This leads to tribal conflicts within new countries, leads to tribal conflicts within new countries, and also leads to fighting between these new countries. So it leads to conflicts within the countries and also fighting between the new countries. Economically, we see little industrialization. Little industrialization leads to an unstable economy after independence. Unstable economy. Natural resources are exported and they're sold as cash crops. Natural resources exported sold as cash crops. Cash crops are sold to other countries for not as much profit. So rather than growing wheat and other things for people to eat, countries instead make the decision to sell those goods as cash crops so they can have money, but then that obviously means there's less food for their own people to eat. So that's a cash crop. Manufactured goods are imported. So if you need machinery or anything that's manufactured, it's going to be imported. And if you are selling only raw materials and you are buying everything manufactured, you are obviously going to pay more for manufactured goods than you're making for your raw materials. And this leads to debt. In addition, countries are in debt from borrowing from other countries, specifically Europe and America. So debts continue to build because they cannot essentially get out of their hole. And then finally, it's the last slide, you guys, you made it. Finally, we see for the people themselves, there is a lack of a skilled, educated middle class. There's a lack of a skilled, educated middle class. Under colonialism, most people are workers. You have a minority of an upper class and upper group, and these are people that are in control of the governments, oftentimes very corruptly, but the majority of people are workers not receiving an education. In addition, we have epidemics and diseases. Epidemics and disease. There's a lack of medical supplies and resources to respond. So we've seen that time and again, most recently with Ebola. Because there's a lack of resources, it's difficult to respond to these epidemics and diseases. The population is exploding. Populations are massively increasing. Resources can't keep up. Food crops are exported, so there's not enough food for the population themselves. Clean water access is limited due to a lack of technology. So clean water is limited. And we see many human rights violations. Human rights violations as governments oppress and brutally control their people. Human rights violations as governments oppress and brutally control their people. They control freedom of speech, freedom of movement, etc. So dictators, their goal is to maintain power through oppression. So we see lots of human rights violations. Now, it's very easy to look at Asia and Africa, I think, more and focus on all these problems. And I think especially from the West, we have that bias and that perspective that we see all these problems and that's all we see of Africa. But I really want to remind you, and something that we will come back to, that Africa is a very diverse continent. It's a massive continent, and we've seen a lot of growth, a lot of positive growth. And despite these legacies, we are seeing African nations continue to prosper. And I don't want to leave you with the idea that Africa is just this poor place, because it is so much more than that, despite the fact that they are still dealing with a lot of these problems. So, congratulations, you have finished your lecture. I'm proud of you. You should be proud of yourselves, and we will talk about it in class next week.